Well, good evening and welcome to the Coral Gables Museum. My name is Yuni Villalonga and I am the chief curator. It's a pleasure to present this event that is a related event to our Venezuelan-themed exhibitions at the museum in this moment. We have, for now, contemporary Venezuelan art of the Miami diaspora, featuring 41 contemporary artists, all Venezuelan based in Florida or South Florida. We also have a small exhibition, two-man exhibition called Venezuela Serious Humor, Venezuela Humor en Serio, that features political cartoons. And we have a solo show by Rafael Barrios, artist Rafael Barrios, called Ontological Curiosity. You're all welcome to come back and see the exhibitions that will be on view until March 15th. This presentation, this book launch, is our sixth related program. We still have two more panel discussions and an amazing closing reception, so stay tuned for more. It is my pleasure to introduce tonight Maria Werlau and Beatrice Rangel, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about Maria. Maria is co-founder and executive director of Free Society Project, also known as Cuba Archive, Archivo Cuba, a non-profit think tank that advances human rights through research and scholarship. Her extensive publications on Cuba cover a wide range of issues: economics, foreign investment, international law, policy, politics, human rights, and others. An independent consultant and former second vice president of Chase Manhattan Bank, she has a Bachelor of Science in Foreign Service from Georgetown University and a Master's in International Affairs from Universidad de Chile. She left Cuba as a child with her family for the U.S. and has lived and worked in the U.S., Puerto Rico, Chile, and Venezuela. We will be talking about her book, Cuba's Intervention in Venezuela, and it is also an honor to present Beatrice Rangel, who is actually Venezuelan-American. She is an international trade consultant and political analyst who will be talking a little bit about the book and Werlau's research, and then we're going to listen to Ms. Werlau. So welcome both, and let's welcome her with an applause. So is it okay to leave the lights on? Right?
Okay, thank you. Well, I am very, very, very grateful to Maria Werlau, the book author, and Yuni Villalonga, the Coral Gables Museum curator, for this invitation. As I suspect, this will be a watershed night in terms of understanding the challenges that are being faced by the nations in the Western Hemisphere. Maria, of course, I believe, is one of the South Florida greatest research assets, and Yuni is a dash of innovation in the city of Coral Gables. The reason for sustaining the thought that the book that Maria is presenting tonight is a watershed in the history of interventions in our hemisphere and the world is based on two facts. First, Maria Werlau's admirable research talent, work discipline, and wise insight into the strategic aims of the hemisphere's master spy, which was Fidel Castro. Second, her work illustrates the shape, content, and direction of occupation in the 21st century. This development, known in the literature as phagocytosis, has not been subject to public scrutiny given its hidden nature and quiet demeanor. Indeed, this development is the process by which a cell uses its plasma membrane to engulf a large particle, giving rise to an internal compartment called the phagosome. Once in place, the phagosome takes over the commanding functions of the particle that is being taken over to become an extension of the invading cell. This is exactly what Cuba has done in Venezuela. The development is brilliantly recorded by Maria Werlau in this book, Cuba's Intervention in Venezuela. This makes this book stand apart from many other written on the subject that lack analytic treatment of this unrecorded political development in our hemisphere's history. Now, as we can see in this presentation, we're going to go to the presentation, she sort of dissects invasions in the 21st century, how they go and how they are. Invasions throughout our history are as follows. First, when Maria was thinking of her book, the question that led Maria's research into the Cuban occupation in Venezuela was, how could a country devoid of natural, economic, and financial resources take over another 3 times as big in terms of population and 10 in terms of territory, with the largest oil reserves in the hemisphere, the most thriving middle class after that of the U.S., and a well-equipped and trained army, mostly educated in the United States? And the answer is, first, all invasions in the past have demanded a lot of preparation and resources on the part of the invading powers. Sparta had to create a float, Hannibal had to organize an army with 1,000 elephants, and Sun Tzu had to mobilize a frightening army. In the 19th and 20th century, logistics, infrastructure, and resources even grew exponentially. From the Napoleonic Wars to the Gulf War, countries had to invest in immense amounts of money in order to be able to occupy the territory of another country. But enter the 21st century, and what do you think is necessary? Well, all you need to invade and conquer in the 21st century is fiber optic. Fiber optic allows a country like Cuba to penetrate Venezuela in a very easy manner. You only invest in a good fiber optic connection, and then you take over the information systems and identification system, the elections, the army, the media, trade through the ownership register, and of course you take over every education. You take over education, and you take over all of civil society as well as all the institutions. Through fiber optics, Cuba leveraged its single strategic asset, which was intelligence, and took over control of Venezuela. And this was possible, it could have never happened without the talent and direction of what we should call the master spy of our hemisphere, Mr. Fidel Castro. And what are the talents that demanded by a master spy? Well, a master spy relies on deceit and trickery, is an expert at both magical and non-magical means of evading detection, and has no attachment to long-term loyalty to anything except himself and power. And they usually are keen observation. They have keen observation skills, are mentally agile and intuitive, masters of disguise and secretive. So, and this was exactly what we had in Castro and in Venezuela. We had in Castro, this was Castro's, it was Castro's strategy toward Venezuela. The Bay of Peace experience taught Fidel Castro the value of information, and ever since he deployed his power resources into the creation of an intelligence service that would secure his grip on power while exploiting other nations' weaknesses and liabilities. And this is why Maria Werlau and her book stand apart with brilliance and universe of publications on Cuba's hemispheric play. Cuba's intervention in Venezuela dissects the phagocytosis that unfolds from 2002 through our days between Venezuela and Cuba. This is clearly described in the prologue. In the prologue, when she says when in the prologue, when she said it's clearly described in the prologue when she, and I quote, attempting to understand Cuba's role in Venezuela from a physical and numeric presence misses the point, because Cuba did not need to deploy any of its assets except information and intelligence, and this is why it deploys with a clear strategy to take over the country. I believe her work illustrates Maria departs from this understanding of every other analyst when she really touches the nerve of Fidel Castro's strategy toward Venezuela. His aim to control the hemisphere was clearly directed at what would be the central nodule of the nervous system of the whole hemisphere. Because from Venezuela, through oil, through the financial system, and through the changing of all the narrative in Latin America, he could maintain control of South America, which is, of course, the strongest geopolitical unity in our hemisphere outside the United States. Maria tells us very clearly that the takeover that Castro designed had revolved around two pillars: the use of information to subdue the Venezuelan society and the use of information to strengthen Cuba. The first pillar aims at destroying the middle class ethos, to substitute education for indoctrination, restrict access to foreign exchange, control election, disperse and penetrate mass media, control access to food and medicines, and subdue the military and open gates to illicit non-state actors into the Venezuelan institutional framework. This is particularly important now because what we are seeing in our hemisphere is the exponential growth of control of non-state illicit actors. For example, if you remember the takeover of Culiacan in Mexico by the drug lords when the life of one of the children of Chapo Guzman was at stake because he was going to be arrested. His operational value was at stake because he was going to be arrested by the authorities. They took over the city, they took over the whole state, and they subdued the military and the police in Mexico. This outgrowth of the illicit actor could have never been possible without Cuba's agreement many, many decades ago to allow the transshipment of drug to the Medellin cartels. So it is important to understand that this model of occupation also has arms and legs outside the country that is being occupied and creates separate and distinct financial sources that are illicit and and that can threaten the nation state as we know it. The second pillar increases the cost of any attack to Cuba, as it holds the secret of the stabilization of Venezuela and gives Cuba a position in international affairs that would clearly lack in terms of resource basket. In the end, this seems to be the exit strategy devised by a mad narcissist like Fidel Castro to continue waging power in our hemisphere after his death. Thank you, Maria, for bringing us in plain light to all the analysts of the world. Thank you.
Well, thanks to you, Beatriz.
PowerPoint.
And thanks to you, Julie. And thanks to the Coral Gables Museum for hosting this event. And especially to all of you for braving the rain and traffic that in Miami we're too spoiled to undertake. Like some of us emigres from New York would feel a little different about that. So I'm going to try to complement the very generous review that Beatriz has done of the book, to not bore you because this is a long PowerPoint that I prepared for a university, and this is not a university class, so I'd rather engage the audience and take some questions and maybe have a dialogue, and then I'm going to very quickly go through this. The book is available in both English and Spanish. I do want to say we have some on sale here, and there is an error by Amazon that we still can't explain how it happened, but there were some books printed with an English cover and a Spanish interior. And we have some of those for $5 if you want to buy them later, because, you know, we have to pay for them anyways, because they did not alter the file. So our file seems to have been hacked, but I'm not going to say something that I'm not sure about. So this is a production by an small think tank with very little resources, but fighting a good fight of information. So that's our asymmetric occupation of the information world. And this is how we wage an asymmetric battle against a gigantic propaganda and influence propaganda, an influence apparatus of the Cuban regime. So I set out to answer this question. This book came about in the strangest of ways through a casual meeting with two leaders of the Venezuelan opposition in New York. And we were talking, and I said, it's very important that you highlight the Cuban role. I've been spending years collecting information. I don't see this a lot. You know, this was back in September of 2018. And they said, yes, we agree, but we have a different crisis every day, humanitarian crisis. And I said, well, let me see what I can put together from my files, et cetera. And when I started to look at the bibliography, it seemed there were a lot of loose pieces, a lot of very good coverage by journalists, both in English and Spanish, most in Spanish, some academic work on very specific aspects of the issue. Very specific, very limited. And of course, some historic material of Cuba's intervention, subversion in Venezuela, in the region, and the world. I had a lot of that in my own library. And I started to assemble this. And this grew from a paper to a book. And I realized how important it was because this has global implications. It's not just about Venezuela and Cuba, and that's important enough and encompasses 40 million people at least. It's important to the region and the world, and that's what I set out to do. And as the investigation progressed, the title changed, because initially it was a question mark, what is Cuba's role in Venezuela? And as I started to amass this and see how extensive, comprehensive, and profound this intervention was, I realized it was an occupation, and that's why the title changed. And an occupation that has real dire implications for the region. So that's just, the chapters. If you have the book, you'll have time to go over this. Let's go, forgive me for going over it very quickly, but I don't want to bore the audience. Again, this is not a class. Let's make it amenable. If you have the chance, hopefully you can read the book. As Beatriz said, this was a big question. I mean, how could a technically bankrupt country like Cuba take over a bigger country like Venezuela, much larger in population, much more developed, with a democracy? Here is a country focused on a model of, central planning that has not worked, that is parasitic. I mean, Cuba can only survive if it has the aid from first the Soviet Union and then Venezuela. How did it accomplish that? And then, that's what the book sets out to describe, how it occupied Venezuela by invitation, really, without firing a shot, and asymmetrically, that is, placing assets in different aspects of society. And Beatriz lays out the information, but there's much more than that. And I was even impressed. I mean, things that I didn't know, and we'll get to. So the important thing is that we need to understand first the nature, history, and long-term strategy of the Cuban regime to colonize Venezuela and expand regionally, and also bring this influence to the world. The depth and scope of Cuba's intervention there, and then what is the meat of the matter, Cuba's core competency, the methodology and tactics arisen from its own totalitarian regime that I called soft power and steroids. There's a chapter that I have fun with because core competency is a business management term that I transported it to explain the geopolitics of the situation. So I start with what Beatriz talked about, which is, where does this all come from? What is interesting is that Fidel Castro arrived in Havana in January of 1959, and 15 days later was already in Caracas, invited by students to celebrate the anniversary of the first year of the overthrow of Pérez Jiménez, the longtime dictator of Venezuela. And he has a meeting with Betancourt that I described. That whole chapter is very historic and descriptive. It's fascinating. I learned a lot at doing the research, and I'm still learning. There's a lot more to this. So this was, and I had primary testimony on this issue. I mean, this is not just amassing other bibliographic material. I interviewed more than 30 sources primarily, but there's fascinating information. There are a lot of it in Spanish, a lot of it is not well known. So this merits some more digging. But in essence, the two of them, Castro and Chavez, developed like a synergy of their own radical and grandiose aspirations. I mean, the two personalities are very similar. I talk a little bit about that. Their history is actually similar. But, Fidel Castro derided Hugo Chavez, in private mocked him. He really didn't respect Hugo Chavez. He just needed his resources, his money, and the geostrategic plan was to take over Venezuela, dominate Chavez, and he actually does it. I describe it briefly. This is consolidated over time, and as Chavez develops cancer and falls really sick, that's when he really gives in, because this was an ongoing process. It was gradual. And then, of course, when Nicolás Maduro is placed as the successor, Nicolás Maduro had trained in Cuba, was a Cuban man, loyal to Cuba, and it consolidates the takeover. But this was a secret alliance, and this was not that it developed over time. I explain why I'm convinced this was a plan. It was a plan. At least I identify it for sure, since Chavez stages a coup d'etat in 1992, is put in prison, and that's when he comes into Fidel Castro's direct radar. But of course, there was a military conspiracy, a military civic conspiracy in Venezuelan society, that it was in different aspects of society, but also in the military, to bring about a radical revolution in Venezuela, and Chavez was part of that. I don't think, and I have not come across any material that says he was working for the Cubans. I don't think so. This happened later. But I think in 92, when Chavez does, there's a trial and he gives a speech, and, that's when he comes into Fidel Castro's orbit, and that's when Fidel Castro, when Chavez is pardoned, less than 2 years later, Fidel Castro arranges to have Chavez come invited as a guest to Cuba, and that's when the whole story unfolds. And then apparently, and I believe this is true because you can piece the different pieces together and get to that conclusion, which I did in the English book. And then for the Spanish version, I had a direct testimony that confirmed that, in fact, Fidel convinces Chavez to, take over Venezuela, like present himself as a candidate for president, and Cuba is going to assist with the election, with secret agents and money, which is something that Cuba had done for decades in Latin America and was very good at doing. And that's how it happened. Of course, Chavez came into the president saying, no, I'm not socialist, but that's what Fidel Castro did in Cuba. And I give a lot of examples of, Fidel Castro in his life talked a lot about this on different occasions, saying, no, we can't tell people what the plan is because the people are not prepared to understand that. So you can, look at the history and quote. One thing about this book is, I tried not to editorialize a lot. So there's a lot of information. The book has 1,600 citations, more than 800 sources. It's all sourced, so the reader can reach different conclusions than I. There are conclusions, of course, and, the information leads me to think this. But I think that the material is good for people who want to have, challenge it with information and, continue the investigation. So that's where, in chapter 3, I laid out, why it's not about the numbers. A lot of the press coverage that you see on Cuba's role in Venezuela is focused on how many Cubans are there in Venezuela. The fact of the matter is, I give the numbers. I cite many, many examples of when Cuban or Venezuelan officials go through the numbers. The last numbers that we have is there's around 46,000 Cubans in Venezuela, according to the Cubans. But since I worked on Cuban issues for many years, and economics, etc., none of the data that Cuba ever gives is verifiable, and then they contradict it. So who knows how many Cubans are in Venezuela? I think the only ones who know are the Cubans, and then a very select few, because the Cubans went into Venezuela through different airports, not going through migration controls, through the regions, and they're spread out all over society. The ones in the military wear civilian uniforms, and it's really hard to know. They're all over the place. Even the santeros who are in the ministries are Cuban in many cases. We'll get to that. So the Cubans essentially took over the different ministries, the ports, the agency that produces the IDs, the passports, and this was done through a whole process where the whole economy of Venezuela was integrated with the Cubans, and Cubans were brought in, and there's another chapter that goes into detail about that, to manage companies in Venezuela. Even in food distribution and production, where Cuba can't even feed its people. Venezuela is paying Cuba to, through intermediaries, import medication, import foodstuffs. I mean, it's a subsidy for Cuba and a way of domination. It's fascinating to do that. Then the whole, thing of how Cuba established control of the military, because I think there's two essential elements to the control. One is information, as Beatriz focused on. The other one is in the military. And Cuba used its own model of control of its own system, although there's a lot of differences, but it works. And one is to buy the loyalties. So you put in generals in control. First, it was political. You divide the country in, and you're the governor of this and the mayor of that, and you started to see the militarization of the political life and society. And then you started to see the generals put in charge of all the industries and the companies. So it's creating loyalties. So you have a lot to lose if you give it up, right? And then, of course, the final thing is, and this took years to get to the point where it is today, where the Cubans' military counterintelligence model has been transcribed to Venezuela, and that's where it really, that's where they really have a grip with surveillance, repression, at first with ideological and political indoctrination and purges of the military, but they really do have an exercise of control, and that's why people say, well, why doesn't the military rise? Well, that's the reason. This model does work. And then, of course, the security apparatus and the civilian aspects of it. It's all over society. There's a section on the colectivos that I had written about in 2014 that fascinated me at the time. I did a lot more work on that. Those are the motorized paramilitaries. But there's another body in Venezuela that is not talked about a lot, which is the Frente Francisco Miranda of young people that was created between Chavez and Fidel. This was announced, publicly. And it's young people who were indoctrinated and trained in Cuba, not just politically, but militarily, that are all over society. And that's the Taliban of Venezuela. Of course, you see a lot of news in English and Spanish on the torture and interrogation of opponents of the military. That's controlled, a lot of it, by Cuba. And then there's two elements that I identified that were salient in terms of changing Venezuelan society. One was, of course, the social missions, the doctors, trainers, sports trainers, teachers that were brought in the tens of thousands to Venezuela starting in 2002, 2003 is when it started, and then it reached its peak. And now, according to Cuba, it's like around 30,000 Cubans are there in social missions. It's hard to tell because nobody can verify that, but it was a populist tool to bring about loyalty to the regime, etc. And it's also a way to monitor the voting. It was an electoral tool. This was described to be by Cuban doctors who had to do this work. It's really fascinating. And it's also to embed agents to monitor and surveil the population, to counter resistance, etc. And importantly, it's a way to subsidize Cuba, because the Cubans are paid, per person, no matter what they're doing, at a rate that is much higher than any Venezuelan earns. Then the second aspect of this is the Cuban branch of Santeria became the extra-official religion of the Bolivarian Revolution. I didn't know about that. I was told by a Venezuelan, and when I started to look into it, I was blown away. It's fascinating. There's a section in the book. If you want to go through the different pieces, I really recommend that part because it was brilliant. Fidel Castro realized in Chavez's trip to Venezuela, to Cuba, the first official trip that Chavez takes to Cuba is December 1994, right after he leaves prison. He's given an amnesty from prison. And apparently, I think, Beatriz, you had a role in this testimony, if I remember correctly. Apparently, this is told by different people. Chavez does apparently go through a Santeria ritual in 94. And there's two Cuban Santeros who are now in exile or in the diaspora who have talked about this. But there's testimony of Venezuelans who had to do with the trip that say that Chavez, since he was very young, was fascinated by black magic, the occult, and all this. And he tells Fidel that there was a bruja, that there's a fascinating book in Spanish by David Placer called Los Brujos de Chavez that tells his story in an amazing way, right? The bruja had told Chavez that he was going to be the president and the king of Venezuela pretty much, but he was going to die young, or before he reached 60, something like that. So Chavez tells Fidel, and Fidel says, don't worry, we have Santeros here that can do a ritual and, save you and whatever. And he devises the Cuban Santeria as a way to manipulate Chavez. But there's also a way to embed agents, and they start bringing the top brass of the military, people in the government, to Cuba to be inducted into Cuban Santeria and start to bring Cuban Santeros or agents as Santeros to go into all of Venezuelan ministries and agencies to monitor society and control. And a Cuban Santero who had to do with this explained it to me. And, it's a really fascinating way to dominate a society Because not like a traditional religion where you have a hierarchy and you have dogmas and stuff, the santero can tell you anything. Can say, go home, sell everything and give it to the poor, or, do this or do that. And, you have no way of controlling this. And in Cuban Santeria, I have known for many years, is heavily infiltrated by the government. So this also fosters a cultural transformation that changes society from the traditional ways, traditional religions, to something, a lot more controllable by the new regime. So then, we have the chapter 5 talks all about the cyber occupation, the control of data, the fatherland card, that people do need to get gasoline, to get food, to get through the social programs. The control is so effective by Cuba. All of these source codes are managed by Cuba. And I had very important primary sources, people who were involved in this program from the start, who traveled with the Cubans, Venezuelans who traveled with the Cubans, etc. The fatherland identity cards, these databases are in Venezuela. There's even a database that has the blood type of Venezuelans and how they control, how they affect cyber repression by their special programs that monitor dissidents, members of the military, celebrities, etc., who they're communicating with social media. It's very sophisticated. That was pretty amazing. And of course, then there's a submarine fiber optic cable that got a lot of news. And, Cuba had said originally that this cable was, a way of Venezuela in helping Cubans achieve data, for less money and higher speeds. And then they said, oh, no, it didn't work. Well, it did work. It is doing what it was meant to do, which is control information in real time. Of course, it did not get transported to the Cuban people with cheaper data and, quicker data. Then I describe how, this is one of my favorite chapters, but, it's a little bit more academic. But I think it's really important because if you don't understand where this is coming from, you might believe this conspiracy cannot be. How can this be? Well, I had identified way back in 2013 that the whole design has to do with Antonio Gramsci, the Italian neo-Marxist, and his theories of cultural hegemony. But that was a deduction of mine, having studied, political science and stuff, and looking at, for example, the use of crime and colectivos that didn't jive with the way an authoritarian system normally controls crime a lot. And in Venezuela, it was the opposite. And that's when I started to think, wait, this is Gramscian. And then, of course, when you look at the change in Cuba in 1989, 90, 92, when there is the end of Soviet communism and the end of Soviet support for the Cuban regime, which was massive, how does Fidel Castro survive? He was the lone survivor of all of the East Central Soviet satellites. How did he do it? He devised a new way of maintaining and gaining power, which is he created the Foro de Sao Paulo with the help of Lula da Silva, who was then the head of the Partido Trabajadores of Brazil, who then became president. But this was Fidel's brainchild. And in the English book that I wrote and published, I think it was August 1st of last year, I didn't have a direct testimony to validate that. Well, I found one out of the blue, and by coincidence, somebody who was very close to Fidel Castro said, around that time, Fidel Castro came to this person who was seeing Fidel Castro a lot at the time. It's in the book, it's described, I'm not going to get into the details, and brought a book by Gramsci and says, this is a new Bible. And because it's obvious. What does Gramsci propose, which is different than the traditional Marxist theory? To take over society through the culture, through the institutions, through the family, through religion, the schools, etc. And that's what I described there. The first, one of the first heads of PDVSA, or maybe the first, I can't remember if he was the first, the General Guaycapuro Lameda, who was put in charge of PDVSA, which is, the largest company in Venezuelan economy, or, it's almost a Venezuelan economy that controls the whole oil sector and the whole petrochemical sector, went to the Ministry of Economics at the time in 2000 and said, these policies, they make no sense. What is going on here? He said, no, you don't understand. This is a plan for the radical transformation of Venezuelan society over 3 generations. This is, this is the way we're going to do this. And Chavez sends Guaycapuro Lameda to Cuba for an indoctrination or an induction into the new radical theory by Fidel Castro himself. And Guaycapuro Lameda has given several interviews on this, which are fascinating. They're cited in the book, and everybody should read what he calls Fidel Castro's recipe. He names it, La Receta de Fidel. It's fascinating. I really recommend it. We don't have no time to get into it. We could spend the whole day here doing this. But the whole idea of putting Gramsci together and this whole Foro de Sao Paulo brainchild was, okay, to do away with the prior way of achieving power was through armed insurrection that Cuba had fomented in the region and all over the world. If you know about Cuba's interventions in Africa, which, in the beginning of the book I get into that and Castro's plans. But now it was to achieve power through elections by, of course, lying, whatever, getting to power, and then from within destroying the institutions, the democratic institutions or the bourgeois institutions, gradually changing the constitution, taking over the judiciary, et cetera, and you saw it very well. If you followed Venezuela, that's exactly what happened in Venezuela, and it's what was happening in Ecuador, in Bolivia, et cetera. Of course, it was rehearsed in Nicaragua originally. So that's why I think this is very dangerous and very important for the region, and why today this has implications. And I get into it in the Spanish book, because if you follow the region, in the fall of last year, we started to see violent eruptions in Ecuador, in Bolivia, in Puerto Rico, and Honduras, in Chile, in Colombia, and all with the same pattern. So I added a section in the Spanish book on this, what I call the new modality of insurrection, which is really not new, because Cuba had rehearsed this in the 1980s when Fidel Castro took on the issue of the external debt of the region. And there's a Venezuelan professor who's writing a book about this. Fascinating. I don't know if you followed the Caracazo, the Meridazo, there were insurrections in many, many cities of Latin America, and it was with the same pattern. So I think this was rehearsed back then. And there's also a professor that I encountered that has written about this, Thais Peñalver, who is Venezuelan, and she's followed these issues. So when you start to put the pieces together, wow, I mean, it makes total sense. And when you look at what's happening in the region, of course, there's a chapter where I describe how Cuba has worked since the start of the regime, since 1959, not only to subvert countries through armed insurrections, but through the infiltration of agents and the capture of agents of influence and direct agents of Cuba in all of these societies. In academia, in the media, in government. We could write books about that. I named some of them. So, these have been from the start ready to, at the order of Cuba, go in and, take over 12 subway stations and destroy them like they did in Chile. Or I don't know how many, but they were all at the same time with the same methodology. And I think what's going on in Chile is clearly an aspect of this. And I do think that it's because this new model that was developed to take over these societies gradually had several structural deficiencies. Number one, it required a lot of money, and Venezuela has run out of money. Number two, it requires to put into place the totalitarian control of society over time. And in Venezuela, they have not been able to do that. I mean, maybe they're making progress, okay? But that was not done like it was done in Cuba initially very quickly. So then you see what happens. In 2015, for example, there were, at my count, 11 presidents of Latin America and the Caribbean, at least 11, because I didn't count all of the little Caribbean islands, were part of the Foro de Sao Paulo. They were at the peak, at the height of their power and domination, and Fidel Castro was gloating about this. I mean, you can pick it up in the media, in Cuban media. Then what happened? And I describe it in the book. You started to see some of those governments fall. Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Peru, etc. And that's at the same time that the economic downturn of Venezuela and the price of oil collapses. So you see a very big change. So what I think they've done, and I don't think they've done it, they've said they've done it. And I quote it in the book, in the Spanish version. The new Grupo de Puebla is the new model. And these new insurgencies is the new way to take over countries. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens. These chapters describe how they did the economic integration. They even integrated the laws and the judiciary. There's Cuban police has the ability to initiate processes in Venezuela, etc. I mean, I get into this. Then there's a chapter that describes this you're reading about a lot in the press, and that's good, alerting people to what's been happening, but this has been happening for years. Cuba used its networks of allies with Iran, China, North Korea, and brought it in, the narco-guerrillas, the Colombians. There's a lot of that in the book, okay? What do they share? These people share the same goals, which is to destroy capitalist, free market democracies and challenge the hegemony of the United States and create a multipolar world that challenges U.S. power. Internally, and this is one thing that I think failed in the Venezuelan process, these are predatory regimes. So Cuba took to Venezuela the same formula that it has used, socialism and central planning for the masses. The scarcity, the lines, the rationing, and excessive privileges for the upper elite that creates loyalty, and cements them in power. But in Venezuela, they took the plunder of the nation to probably, incredible. I think it hasn't been seen in the history of the planet what the Venezuelan elite has stolen from the country, which is also puts it into question the model. But you've seen that same formula in the other countries. But that criminal network and the way that they do business with extra-regional allies, what does it guarantee? It guarantees financial resources and other resources, not just financial, logistical, geostrategic, and military coordination. Shared intelligence is very important. And, for example, they're sharing biotechnology. I mean, I follow North Korea, Iran. It's, they're in sync. And the crafting of international support. So when you hear about Venezuela, for example, the Guaidó government has, 50-something? I never get a straight number. But, okay, a little less than 60 countries recognize the Guaidó presidency or government as the legitimate government. Well, there's 190 governments or more, 194 or something like that, represented at the UN. Guess who they support? Those are the little countries, in the Caribbean and the Pacific and Africa and the Middle East that are supporting this. And this is the most important chapter in the book, I think, in terms of explaining how Cuba was able to do this. Because what I say, Cuba has mastered a perverse form of soft power. Soft power is, sort of a political science term to describe how a country uses resources to sort of influence others, not through traditional means like military occupation. So Cuba has spent 6 decades developing asymmetrical capabilities that very few states would even think of employing. I get into details of how the intelligence services work, how they use blackmail, and dark tactics, even murder and assassination. They have, this is documented but not well known enough to understand how it was able to do that. The singular toolkit comes from Cuba's formidable intelligence and propaganda apparatus that is enabled by its own system that allows for the country. I mean, if the Politburo controls all the resources and doesn't have to answer to the people, you can dedicate these resources to surveillance, repression, disinformation, propaganda, and influence. If I read one chapter of the book, I think I'm going to read on that. Let me see if it comes up. And it says, Cuba's core competency, its main comparative advantage, is rooted in the centralized command and control nature of its totalitarian system. This allows a regime to operate free of bureaucratic institutional rules and restraints that characterize even the weakest democracies. Unconstrained by judicial, ethical, and moral boundaries, it faces no separations, balance of powers, or requirements for transparency and accountability. The Cuban Politburo and Communist Party leadership has absolute power to strategize with great consistency as well as ample flexibility to use even the most unsavory tactics. It can act very quickly without the need for consultation, and it can plan for the long term as well as wait patiently. As its power is enduring and faces no electoral challenges or term limits, its directives are passed from the top down to be implemented by a huge number of orderlies in a large infrastructure of institutionalized apparatuses essentially designed to carry orders. That's why Cuba is so successful, in my view. Of course, I give examples. I get into some of the pernicious taxes of Cuba's unique brand that is actually already happening with Venezuela, like the forced migration and the remittances and other things that come from that. But I don't have time to get into this and why this is effective. It's effective, thus it's dangerous. And you see it because you see Cuba, a bankrupt country, a little Caribbean island, has been able to survive for over 6 decades, is able to command and manipulate perceptions. I mean, Raúl Castro was received with red carpet by many governments that have gone, when the normalization took place in the United States, the premiers, presidents of many countries went to kiss, Raúl Castro and make amends, and seek business opportunities, and, there's absolutely no problem in doing business and accepting the regime as if it were the government. This, in my opinion, is a criminal regime, and our project documents some of its worst crimes. There's no problem, and the media, if you read the media in most of the world, what is it doing? I mean, it successfully took the David and Goliath narrative of the U.S., attempting to take over Cuba's sovereignty, the embargo, etc. But you don't normally see the human rights violations that are going on in Cuba that are systematic, etc. So the regime has been able to achieve international impunity, legitimacy, and support, and that has translated into an inertia in Venezuela until very recently. There's a chapter on the international response. I can't get into that. There's a chapter in Norway in the politics of peace. This was important because Norway had a role, and very few people have looked into Norway's role in Latin America. And then the conclusions that we've gone over, why this happened, and a lot of it has to do with a lot of naivete, a lot of ignorance of the history and the nature of this regime, the disbelief that this could happen. I remember telling friends and colleagues, I lived in Venezuela, and I stay in touch with Venezuelans, following the Venezuelan issue very early on. And in fact, I gave talks on this in academic circles, so it's documented that I said this. I said, this is happening. This is going to be a checklist. It's going to be gradual. It's going to adapt to the circumstances of the country. But this is coming. And they would say, you're crazy, you're paranoid, you're making Cuba bigger than it is. I said, no, you don't understand. This is how these people work. And there's very, very few people who have followed this. For many years, I have studied the mechanisms of repression, the methodology, how Cuba worked, how the intelligence service surfaced, how it was created by the KGB. You know, I've had personal testimony from many of these defectors, you know, people who've worked in the regime. This has been a mess. It's there. This information is there. It's not very well known. It's not easy to get, but it's there. So this, to me, is not a surprise. I have to confess that the level of the destruction of Venezuela is a surprise. But what happened, that a lot of these governments in Latin America did not put in place and still do not have counterintelligence and tactics to counter Cuba's work. That's the case in Chile, for example. After the Concertación came in and there was a shift from the Pinochet regime to the democracy, I understand that Chilean counterintelligence services were not tracking the Cubans, so, you know, the way the Cubans work through the embassies, through their diplomats, through the groups, community groups, you know, ample space to do their work. So, in essence, that's one of my conclusions on this. These regimes do not respond to appeasement or dialogue. They must be defeated. You know, any time that they sit down for dialogue, it's to gain something in exchange, to gain time, to become, you know, stronger. So it's really important that anybody who has to do with hopefully bringing about a peaceful transition in Venezuela understands that one of the key elements has to be to have the Cubans out of there, but in all its aspects, in the electoral system, in the information, not just in the military, in the obvious things. I went through that, and that's the end of this, and I will take some questions, comments, critiques, challenge me. Yes. Yeah. So, your first question, how did the Venezuelan leadership allow this? Well, this is an occupation by invitation. So I think a lot of things happen. You get a leadership that has participated in the plunder of its own country. Okay? So that, you know, they created loyalty. I describe it in the book. How did this happen? A lot of it has to do with human nature, I think, too. And, you know, of course, I can't get into it in the book. But I think the way that it was done, it's like, how did Fidel Castro institute a totalitarian system in Cuba? You know, how did he turn, for example, the fight against the Batista regime that was going to restore Cuba to democracy in the Constitution of 1940? So that we could spend a lot of hours analyzing how people fall for those populist, you know, governments. And also the model, I describe in the chapter in Venezuela, for example, some of the things were implemented in Venezuela that were implemented in Cuba. Like the military doctrine was changed to la guerra de todo el pueblo, the war of all peoples, the militarization of society, the colectivo. I mean, this is like, it's very sophisticated. And a lot of people, you know, a lot of Venezuelans probably didn't catch on until very late in the game. There were very few that were probably seeing what was happening, and then there were some in the middle, and then, some pretty late.
And Venezuelans continue very bravely, I would say,
Yes.
to demonstrate in the streets, and a lot of the young kids are killed.
Yeah.
So I applaud that.
Yeah, the Cubans staged a revolt. Thousands of Cubans died in the mountains fighting, and they were small farmers. They were not, the elite in Cuba. This is very complex. We're not going to, answer it. I do want to give Beatriz a chance because I think she is Venezuelan and she can talk about that. But to go to your second question before Beatriz can speak, I don't want to digress into the U.S. and whatever because we're going to go out of, on a tangent. But I do want to point that there's some scholars talking about cultural Marxism and how it's affecting our society. And I do quote in the book this fascinating video. Actually, there's several videos by a defector or deserter from the KGB in the late 1970s, Yuri Bezmenov. Look it up in the bibliography. And if you go into YouTube and you see his videos, it talks about how the Soviet Union, since the end of the World War, started to influence U.S. academia and society with the generational process in mind that Fidel talks about that Guaycapuro Lameda talks about. And I think it's really fascinating to listen to that and see what we see a lot in America. You want to...
So I just wanted to add to your brilliant analysis two structural traces of the Latin American countries, which Venezuela shares with every single Latin American country, and this is why they are so vulnerable to these kind of strategies as the one developed over the years by Fidel Castro. One is that our Latin American societies are rent-structured. They are economic systems that were not built to create wealth, but to extract rent. When you have a rent-extracting society instead of wealth-creating society, what you have is a dependence of most of the society on the political play of the elites. And because of that, then you really have like two countries. You have the elites that are modern, global. They have a middle class culture, and then you have the backward society, which is people that thrive in the, they escape from poverty. They are trying to escape from poverty. They live mostly in subsistence levels, and the brilliance of the strategy is that what you do to the elites, you can easily buy loyalty. For example, in the case of Venezuela, very many of the business community supported Chavez and supported the whole system. Why? Because when Chavez decided to set up the price control and the exchange control, everybody thought, okay, now if I behave well and I please him, I'm going to be allowed to charge the prices that I need to charge in order to make a profit, and I'm going to have access to cheap foreign exchange. And that was the way they bought the loyalty of the business community in Venezuela. Of the poor, they bought it with the missions. One of the things that I remember telling everybody in Venezuela, when Chavez launched the famous missions, the one with the doctors, for healthcare, immediate healthcare for the population, that was called Barrio Adentro, was do not publicly. What you need to do right now is to use the judicial system that at that time was independent or semi-independent to get some measures to protect, so to impede that they take over without making any political statements against the program. Why? Because these are people that have never seen a doctor in their slums. And now they're seeing doctors that are in their slums, and so if they don't care if the doctors are Chinese or they are Martians, they have a doctor there. Because what used to happen before, if a boy had cut himself a finger, they would have to take him down the mountain. All the neighbors collaborating, and then they would have no need to get a car, and then get into the hospital. By the time the wound would have been infected, and what they did very cleverly was to put these Cuban doctors there that could take care of these events. So what you needed was to ask the courts to do restraining orders, because these people, according to the law of Venezuela, could not practice medicine because their degrees were not valid in Venezuela.
Thank you. Let's not get into that, because we have a whole project on medical missions, and there's a section on the book that addresses that issue. But this is, when you think about the psychology of people, these things are well thought out. They're not like random. And that's how this is being done. And when you look at Chile, it's the opposite. Chile has the highest social mobility and the highest rates. And look at what's happening in Chile. And we're not going to get into that, but this is well thought out to take over countries. This is not a random sort of thing, let's see what happens. Any questions?
First of all, you might have critique, but I'm not even going to go there. Your work is, I'm sure that you put on a lot of hard work in there, and it's a wonderful work.
Thank you.
There's one word that I've not heard, and I think it's important to realize that there is a core value in thieves. Dishonesty is a value for thieves. Blackmailability. Blackmailability. That is, and it's there, unfortunately. Blackmailability is how. There's a core value that was used to engage people into supporting the Castro regime. It didn't start there. Before we had the Stasi in Germany, and the KGB, and before that the Bolsheviks, and before that the Fabians. It just goes on and on. And really, I think it's envy has something to do, a lot to do with communism. That's the root thing. But they blackmail you either with candy. You know what they used to do?
Yes. Well, I was born in Cuba, but left when I was 8 months old. I'm a U.S. citizen. I'm Cuban, Venezuelan, Chilean, Puerto Rican, American.
In the schools, they used to tell the kids to pray.
I know.
Jesus would candy.
Yeah.
And then pray to the
Well,
and the candy would show up.
Yeah. This is the chapter on Cuba's core competency would be, if I had the time, I didn't even have time for this book, if I had the time, would be my next book. Because that is the way that Cuba has made inroads, not just in the region, all over the world. According to the testimony of defectors from Cuban intelligence, there's around 5,000 relationships of influence in the United States by Cuba. This little, country has one of the best intelligence services in the world, formed by the KGB, trained by the KGB. I've looked into this for many, many years. I've visited, the former headquarters of the Stasi, the Czech police, how they work. It's a fascinating way that Cuba has developed this, but blackmail is one of their singular, tools. And I give some examples in the book. I don't know. I think I do give this example in the book. It's cited. how, I think it was Rafael Correa's. No, this is Venezuela. Chavez was naming closet homosexuals in high offices because, of course, they have a dossier of intelligence on you. So this is a way to buy your loyalty. If they know that you have a second, a secret life and you're married and have kids, then they pull it out. This is, I think I do cite it in the book, but there's so many examples of this. And that's why I say, they're not restrained. They don't have the normal restraints that we have in, even in the weakest democracies. In this country, I've had to do with Washington and different parts of the government to do anything. They have to consult with 20 lawyers. The Defense Department, the State Department, they have to submit to elections. They have media. It's like Cuba doesn't have any of that. Imagine for 60 years you have all the resources to do whatever you want. And that chapter is really important because it talks about why Cuba is so powerful in the UN. Why it has deployed, the support system in international organizations and how they have bought their way through power and influence in those bodies. And that translates to Venezuela. And some Venezuelans have talked about how the Venezuelans were telling them, the government Venezuelans were telling them, the Cubans are telling us to be patient, that eventually we're going to get to the level that Cuba got, which is total impunity. Yes, Fernando.
Thank you for the presentation tonight. Quick question though, in terms of jurisdictions, can we speculate the next jurisdictions will be Colombia, Spain, and ultimately the United States, without getting into politics, of course. But can we speculate on this?
Well, in the book, I don't speculate. In the book, I added sections on Colombia and Mexico. Very briefly on Mexico. Colombia has been a target, and I get into it, and that's why I wrote the chapter on Norway. It's really important. It's on the verge. I think I'm very, very concerned about Chile and what's going on there, and it's really, really surprising. When you ask your question, what about the elites? How did they let this happen? I'm following Chile on a daily basis, and I want to cry when I see what's going on there. The government doesn't know how to deal with it, to put it kindly. I think also the media has been infiltrated by this narrative, and in the case of Chile, for example, I think the guilt trip with the dictatorship didn't allow for a proper narrative that put the Allende government and the whole Pinochet regime in context with the history, because Cuba had a role. Cuba was going to take over Chile. And that's why you had a coup. And then sadly, a dictatorship came in that committed crimes against the people, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't want to get into the US and Spain, but clearly what's happening in Spain is connected because Podemos is connected. That's proven. That's not speculation. I like to use data, not, but when you read the tea leaves, it's frightening. Manny.
Yes, I think in terms of your question, what you need to do is look at Bernie Sanders' never mind what he says on Castro, but the following that he has, and the fact that he's totally consistent. He hasn't heard his ideology and his sentiments. And so this is certainly the ultimate goal of the Gramscian project in the United States. I guess my question, Maria, and I don't know to what degree you have thought of this or material, but you look at the United States, and there is the economic system that works so well. You can look outside of the United States and see the disaster, the Cuban disaster of Venezuela, and all the communist systems, and yet to this religion, this ransom religion. And I guess my question is, what is it? What is the attractive? What is the heart of the attractiveness? And are there any ways to combat that? Admittedly, like any other religion, it is, it's very complex, very, it happens on many levels. But I'm wondering something where you have gathered material that tries to look at what is it that drives people towards that.
Well, the material I do have is a long, extensive library on Cuba. That's what I know a little bit about. And when you look at Fidel Castro and what he was able to do in Cuba and the manipulation of the masses, Fidel Castro was a student of Hitler, Stalin, a student of Gramsci, of history. So I think, it's human nature. When you look at, for example, if you tell people, look what happened in Cuba, they would say, es la revolución del callo. So what does that mean? Until they stepped on your toes, you were with the regime. But when it was against your neighbor because they had 2 cars and you had 1, or you had a better house or whatever, that's very dangerous. It's human nature. I think the only antidote to that is information. And nowadays, my son calls me all the time and says, but the problem with today's, mediums is like, you don't know, you have so much information, you're inundated, and what is fake news and what is not. I mean, there are big challenges there. So I tell him, well, all I can do is I try to balance out. I read the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, National Review to get an idea. Imagine even trying to to follow our country and have some balance. I don't have the answer to that, but I think this material is very important because we see what happened in those societies, and that is a real and imminent threat. It's not a speculation. We're seeing the results of what happened in Cuba and what happened in Venezuela and what can happen in the region and in the world. And then you have nefarious actors like Russia. I mean, you know what? It's funny for me that people are so concerned all of a sudden about Russia when Russia has been doing this for decades. I mean, all you had is, so now it's not called communist, but you have essentially pretty much the same, the KGB was restructured with a different name, the same tactics, the same agents, the same training pretty much. And, people are rightly so concerned with Russia. But this is not new and it's not novel. They've been interfering. Not just, I suggest, for example, in the bibliography are the Mitrokin archives. Mitrokin was the chief archivist of the KGB who left with 2 containers of information and was taken out to the UK. And that archive is available in Cambridge, but it has been put into 2 books, into 2 volumes about the work of the KGB. And one of the volumes is the work of the KGB in the Third World, and mostly in Latin America through its proxy, Cuba. They've been using these tactics forever. But, for some reason, they're so successful that when we talk about the 70s and the 80s in Latin America, people are talking about the bad CIA that was doing this. And no, there was a Cold War, and the KGB was actively trying to bring communism to the region. So information is really important. That's, at least the way I can contribute to put my little, grain of sand. Our hostess has a question. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very good presentation. During the preparation of the shows on Venezuelan art, I had the opportunity to speak to many Venezuelans, Venezuelan artists and critics, and I said that there is a bit of a hope of what it goes. But coming from the Cuban school of thought, being raised there, I don't feel the same way. And, I could not avoid what to compare it to the case of the leader of the Christian liberation movement, that somehow had similar characteristics in that he had a big international support. At some point, the Cuban government would incarcerate everybody around
Okay, so I quote Guaido in the sense of what he said and the Venezuelan leadership has said about Cuba's intervention, so that you can see and cite. I have a hard enough time trying to understand the Cuban opposition to even pretend to understand the very complex, makeup actors of the Venezuelan opposition. I hear this, I hear that. I'd rather not get into it, but I do want to say, and end this in a positive note, we should never lose hope. Never. And we should never stop fighting for the truth and for freedom. So that's why, this is our little contribution to this. And always, and I say, look, in the Cuban issue, who knows what could happen? I don't do this for myself or to go back to Cuba or whatever. I do this because this is the right thing to do, and somebody has to do it. And if we, the Venezuelans or the Cubans or whoever says, oh no, let somebody else do it, then who's going to fight for truth, freedom, justice? Look at the suffering. Because look, I was thinking about this today, and I'll end with this because this has gone long enough. And I was thinking, this is a challenge for a little outfit like ours, because we try to add value with information, facts that can be cited, that can help. But this is not about facts. It's not about numbers. It's about real people that are suffering, people who don't have to eat. I mean, this is the story. I get up in the morning and I do 2 hours of news from Cuba, Venezuela, whatever. And this is the story you see every day. People who don't have basic fundamental freedoms as well as basic necessities of life, that are suffering horrible injustices. So this is why this is important, and not just from the point of view, of elevated, discourses on political science or Gramsci or whatever. Of course, you need to understand it. But this is about people, and we should never lose hope on our people. So thank you very much. And so I'll be happy to sign some books if you want to buy some, if you want to buy the $5 ones with the wrong cover but the right content. Give it to your friends. I appreciate that. Thank you very much for Juni and for coming.